I stood frozen in shock, staring at the letter in my hand. I blinked twice, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. But no, it was still there, in big, bold letters on HOA letterhead. Excessive quantity of zucchini, under investigation. My crime. Unauthorized agricultural expansion leading to community disruption. What on earth did that even mean? Was the HOA accusing me of running some sort of underground cucumber trade? Had my tomatoes become a neighborhood menace? I stepped out onto my back porch and took in the scene. My modest garden, which was maybe a little overzealous. I had tomatoes, peppers, corn, squash, and even a small herb patch. But was this really worthy of an official complaint? It's not like I was running a pumpkin smuggling operation out of my garage. Then came the knock on my door. Karen McAllister, the HOA president, stood there, holding a thick binder in one hand, phone in the other, a smirk on her face like she was about to ruin someone's day and enjoying every second of it. Behind her, 2 other board members flanked her like obedient sidekicks. "Mr. Thompson," she said in that tone, like I was a repeat offender, "we've received multiple complaints about your farming activities." I looked past her at my backyard and back to her. "You mean my garden?" I asked. Karen's lips tightened. "Your illegal expansion of agricultural crops, yes." I almost burst out laughing. "There's no rule against gardens." Karen dramatically flipped through her binder, turning it around and pointing to a line of text. "Homeowners are required to maintain their property in a manner consistent with the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood." I stared. "And you think tomatoes are a threat to aesthetic harmony?" She sniffed. "You have corn growing taller than the fence. It's a security risk." "Security risk?" I repeated, trying to wrap my mind around her ridiculous claim. "Are you worried burglars are going to hide behind my corn stalks? Or maybe some radical zucchinis are going to stage a coup at the HOA meeting?" The board members behind her murmured in agreement. One even took a step back, like my rogue vegetables might attack any second. Karen crossed her arms. "You have 1 week to remove the unauthorized crops, or we'll issue fines." I crossed my arms right back. "Show me the rule that says I can't have a garden." There was a brief flicker of hesitation on her face, but it was quickly masked by a tight smile. "It falls under property beautification standards." "Oh, so it's not actually written down anywhere." Karen's eye twitched. "It's implied." "That's funny," I said, scratching my head. "I read the rulebook before moving in. Didn't see anything about vegetable gardens. And by the way, implied rules don't hold up in court." The board members looked uncomfortable. Karen wasn't backing down. "You have 1 week," she repeated, before turning and storming off, her minions trailing behind her like good little parrots. I shut the door and immediately opened the HOA bylaws on my laptop. As expected, there was nothing about gardens, crops, or rogue zucchinis. Naturally, I ignored the warning. A week later, the fines started rolling in, $200 for excessive agricultural growth. 2 days later, another fine for $300 for not complying with community standards. Then came the notices. They taped them to my door, stuffed them in my mailbox, and even left one on my windshield. By the end of the month, I had nearly $5,000 in fines. The kicker? My neighbors loved my garden. Frank, an elderly guy from down the street, swapped home-baked bread for fresh tomatoes. A couple thanked me for the free herbs. My vegetables were feeding the neighborhood, and the only ones upset about it were the HOA. Then things took a turn. One morning, I walked outside to find Karen and a couple of HOA members inspecting my garden, clipboards in hand. "What are you doing?" I asked, marching over. Karen didn't even look up. "Documenting evidence." "For what?" I asked. She snapped a photo of my cucumbers. "For the upcoming lawsuit." I nearly tripped over a squash vine. "A lawsuit?" Karen smiled. "That creepy. I'm about to make your life miserable." Smile. "The HOA is suing you for failure to comply with community regulations." I stood there, waiting for her to say gotcha, or something that would hint she wasn't totally losing her mind. But she was serious. They were actually suing me over vegetables. I could have panicked. I could have ripped out my plants, apologized, and begged for forgiveness. Instead, I did something much better. I hired a lawyer. Gregory Bell was the best and most delightfully petty lawyer I could find. His whole career revolved around fighting HOA abuse cases, and he took particular pleasure in destroying their ridiculous claims. When I showed him the paperwork, he laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. "This is a gold mine," he said, flipping through the papers. You're telling me they fined you for breaking a rule that doesn't exist? Yep. Greg grinned. We're going to destroy them. And just like that, the war against the HOA guarding Gestapo was on. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that by suing me, she had just opened the biggest can of worms possible. When you try to enforce rules that don't exist, the legal system tends to take it personally. So I geared up for battle, and the courtroom was going to be wild. Greg Bell thrived on absurdity. The moment I handed him the lawsuit, he treated it like Christmas morning, eagerly flipping through the pages with a grin. He whistled low and shook his head as he read Karen's ridiculous claims. They're really going all in, he muttered. Excessive agricultural expansion? Threat to property values? Community disruption? Did you start a farm-to-table restaurant in your backyard? I gave Frank 3 tomatoes, I said. Greg laughed, but it wasn't just a normal laugh. It was the kind of laugh that said someone was about to have way too much fun at someone else's expense. This is perfect, he said, slamming the papers down. They don't have a case. You're sure? I asked. Because I don't trust them to play fair. Greg gave me the look you give someone who just asked the dumbest question ever. They've already been unfair, he said. And that's exactly why they're going to lose. The hearing was scheduled for the next week, and the HOA didn't let up. The fines kept coming, each more ridiculous than the last. $400 for obstructing property symmetry with vegetation. $600 for unauthorized soil use. $1,000 for non-compliance with neighborhood farming restrictions, despite the fact there were no such restrictions. The night before the hearing, I saw Karen talking to an HOA board member at the end of my driveway. She saw me watching, smirked, and snapped another picture of my garden. I smiled back. Tomorrow, she was going to get a legal beatdown. The courtroom was supposed to be serious, but as soon as the judge walked in and Karen took the stand, it started to feel like a bad sitcom. She came with a full PowerPoint presentation, complete with grainy photos of my garden, like she had busted me running an illegal corn cartel. She clicked through the slides, explaining in detail how my vegetables were destroying the neighborhood's harmony. The best part? She had an expert witness, her cousin Greg, who worked in HR at a mattress company and had zero legal expertise. Greg Bell almost choked on his coffee. My client is being fined for violating a rule that doesn't exist, he said when it was his turn. This is not a misunderstanding. This is fraud. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Bell, are you suggesting the HOA fabricated regulations? Greg pulled out the official, unaltered HOA rulebook, handed it to the judge, and flipped to the landscaping section. This is the rulebook from before my client moved in, he said. Nowhere does it say he can't have a vegetable garden. It mentions lawn care, tree heights, and paint colors, but nothing about crops. Karen, sitting smugly at the plaintiff's table, barely flinched. The HOA recently passed an addendum, she said. Greg's smile grew wider. Yes, they did. But according to community bylaws, rule changes must be voted on by the majority of homeowners. Was this rule voted on? The judge asked. Karen hesitated. That's irrelevant, she finally said. Actually, it's extremely relevant, the judge said, cutting her off. Greg flipped to another document. This, he said, holding up a copy of the HOA's most recent amendments, was printed last week. My client was fined for violating this rule long before that. The judge turned to Karen. You're issuing penalties based on a non-existent regulation. Karen's face turned a deeper shade of red. This is outrageous, she snapped. Our job is to maintain community standards. We have full discretion. The HOA does not have discretion to make up laws and enforce them retroactively. The judge interrupted. If there was no rule at the time of these fines, then they're not legally enforceable. Karen shut her mouth. The judge turned to me. Mr. Thompson, have you been financially affected by these improper fines? Yes, Your Honor, I said, trying to keep a straight face. The fines have been aggressive and frequent. I've also been harassed by the HOA, including unauthorized surveillance and intimidation. Greg pulled out the stack of fines and harassment records. The judge shook her head. $1,000 for soil usage, she said aloud. Are you serious? Karen sat frozen. The judge sighed. The fines are voided. You are entitled to reimbursement for any paid penalties. And if you wish to file for damages, you may. Karen tried to speak, but the judge silenced her with a hand. This hearing is over. Greg leaned over and whispered, You want to go for damages? We could get enough to expand your garden. I smiled. Oh, we're not done yet. The court ruling sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. News spread faster than I could imagine. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Most of the messages were from neighbors who'd been quietly cheering me on but didn't want to get involved in the drama. Frank called me right away. "Tom," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. "I heard the news. You beat the HOA." "Yeah," I said, still processing. "I did. You know what this means, right?" Frank said, "No more corn police." I laughed. "I'm not sure the corn police ever existed, Frank. But you're right. We're free." The next day, I filed a counterclaim for damages. The HOA's harassment had cost me more than just money. It had made me feel like a criminal for enjoying my garden. When Greg said we could really stick it to them with damages, I didn't hesitate. What I didn't expect was how the counterclaim would totally unravel Karen's world. Neighbors who'd been afraid to stand up to her started flooding the board with emails demanding accountability. Some even circulated petitions for Karen's resignation. Then a local news outlet picked up the story. The headline: Suburban HOA sued for fabricating laws to fine homeowners over gardens. It painted Karen as the villain and turned her into a laughingstock. I read it and couldn't stop laughing. Karen couldn't control the narrative anymore. The community had turned on her. Then came the ultimate punchline. I got a letter from the HOA. Not a fine, not a warning. A resignation letter from Karen McAllister as HOA president. The pressure from the community had been too much. She and the board members who'd supported her were out. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I texted Frank immediately. "You were right," I wrote. "No more corn police. And Karen's out." He called me immediately, and we shared a laugh. "Well, Tom, looks like you turned the tables. Just don't go planting a forest in your backyard. All right. I'll stick to zucchini for now," I grinned. "But I've got plans." The HOA was left leaderless after Karen's resignation. Without her iron fist, the rest of the board members floundered. A power vacuum formed, and that's when I saw my opportunity to make a real difference. I didn't want to take over the HOA, but I knew I could push for transparency and fair regulations. The new board, overwhelmed by the leadership shift, was more than willing to listen. Soon, I had gathered a group of homeowners who shared my vision of a fairer, more open HOA. We discussed how to avoid future situations like mine and how to establish clearer rules. It felt good to know we were building a better, more democratic neighborhood. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed one final, sweet act of revenge. So, I planned a block party. I sent out invites to everyone on the block, promising fresh produce from my garden. Neighbors were thrilled. No one had ever done anything like it before. Then I had an idea. At the party, I'd make sure everyone knew this event was brought to you by the unapproved, excessively large garden in my backyard. I invited Frank to bake bread, had my tomatoes ready for salads, cucumbers for pickles, and peppers for a hearty salsa. And, of course, I had a platter of grilled zucchini. The party day arrived, and as I set up, I felt proud. This wasn't just a party, it was my victory lap. My neighbors flooded in, excited to taste the produce, and the atmosphere was electric. Karen was nowhere to be found, probably still licking her wounds. The food was great, the music was lively, and soon I had completely flipped the narrative on my garden. At one point, I overheard someone ask, "So, Tom, what's next? Another vegetable army to fight the HOA?" I chuckled. "Nah, no need for that. The HOA's been taken care of. But I might expand a bit. You know, for the people." As the night went on, surrounded by neighbors enjoying the food from my garden, I realized something. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit or taking down Karen. It was about community. It was about coming together despite the absurd challenges we faced. And it was my garden, once the thing that got me in trouble, that had brought us all together. As I stood there, surrounded by friends, I couldn't help but smile. Karen may have thought she could crush me with her fines and rules, but she never counted on one thing: the power of a good zucchini.